Hello guys, and welcome to this video, and you are wondering what the best water type Pokemon card of all time is, aren't you? I mean, why else would you click on this video? Many of you probably already have a couple of cards coming to mind of what the best card could be, but for me and my uneducated brain that doesn't know every single thing about every single little format, I decided to go and dig up a whole bunch of research to find out what were the best cards. I did a lot of number crunching, and of course there are some lacking data points, but I did the best with I could, and I found out some really cool things and probably found out about some statistics that will surprise you and probably some cards you have never heard about. So let's go ahead and find out together what the best water type card of all time is. If we start going back down memory lane, starting with base set, there is one card that almost everyone and their grandma knows because it's Blastoise. Blastoise had the Pokemon Power Radiance, which let you as many times as you wanted during your turn put an water energy card from your hand to one of your water Pokemon, which let Blastoise attack for Hydro Punch, Articuno, which could freeze die and potentially paralyze your opponent, or do Blizzard, which is 50 and 10 spread, or even Lapras, which also had a water gun attack which could do up to 30 damage. Now this deck was not very meta. In fact, base set is very big basic based, and while older divisions weren't a huge fan of it back in the day, Blastoise was seen with a whole bunch of younger pilots bringing it to some decent success, being about 7% of the meta back in 1998. And 2001 Feraligatr was the king. Apparently everyone and their mother played Feraligatr back then. The true dominance of this deck isn't really known because there is so much missing data, but from the data I do have, he is 30% of the meta. Feraligatr had a really cool attack called Riptide. For 3 water energy, you did 10 base damage, and it did 10 more damage for each water energy in your discard pile, shuffling them back in after this attack, and its Pokemon Power Downpour paired very well with it, letting you sack an water energy from your hand into your discard pile. But this deck was so funny because it played a whole bunch of cards that weren't necessarily good in other decks, like Trash Exchange and Misty's Wrath, which this just let Feraligatr go to really high numbers. It makes sense why it was basically the entire meta back in the day. But unfortunately, Feraligatr's reign only really lasted like a whole year. In 2002, it basically vanished, replaced by Dark Feraligatr, who was about 10% of the meta. Dark Feraligatr is really cool in my opinion, because its Pokemon Power Scare, if it was in the active, shut off all baby Pokemon and shut off their attacks and shut off the baby Pokemon power. Dark Feraligatr just said, I am done with this meta, infested with baby Clefas, Magpies, and Pichus, and I'm just going to destroy them. And I kind of like that. The other deck running around back then that was water type was Kingdra, and this was about 9% of the meta. It was also fairly popular, and it also punished the baby meta since the babies were not protected on the bench, and Genetic Memory, its first attack, used an attack from one of Kingdra's pre-evolutions, and people typically copied Mud Splash, which was 30 damage to the active, choosing one of the bench Pokemon, and if you get a heads, it does 10 damage to that Pokemon. And now we're past Wizards, we're going on to early Pokemon, which is still missing a lot of data, but has some kind of data thanks to these really cool websites that are doing their best to catalog the past. And in the RSPK era, the first water Pokemon to make a splash is Ludicolo in 2005. Ludicolo was about 13% of the meta, and paired with Smooth Over Magcargo, yes, the card did get reprinted at one point, it could use its ability Swing Dance in tandem with Magcargo Smooth Over to guarantee any one card that it's missing for the turn, and its attacks were actually pretty good. Healing Steps was 30 for 1 and let you discard as many number of cards from your hand to heal that much damage from Ludicolo, and Circular Steps did 10 times another Pokemon play, excluding Ludicolo. making it a somewhat decent tanky attacker in a slower meta and was fairly popular for the time. However, Ludicolo pales in comparison to the next king to come up, the EX era king, Blastoise EX, which in 2006 was about 29.7% of the meta. Paired with Lugia's EX and Castform or Holland's Magneton, you were able to swing like back-to-back turns with Lugia EX's Elemental Blast, and you're like, wait a minute, if you only have basic water energy in the deck, how can you attack with Lugia EX, who needs 3 different energy types? Now, what you do, my dear sir, is you accelerate 2 water energies onto Lugia. You have either Holland's Castform or Holland Magneton in your hand. For your manual attachment for turn, you swap one of those water energies for the Holland's Castform or Magneton, and boom, bada bop bop, 200 damage from nowhere. Now we're moving on to Diamond and Pearl, and water as a type didn't have as many highs as it did back when Blastoise EX and Feraligatr popped up as decks, but we did start off with an interesting deck. Empoleon from Diamond and Pearl base was a very interesting deck. It had 2 variations of the deck. On its own, a pure Empoleon deck, you ran Busted Rare Candy, which let you evolve the turn you play into a stage 1 or a stage 2 Pokemon, and with the tool Cessation Crystal, as long as the Pokemon in the active has Cessation Crystal, you shut off their Pokepowers and Pokebodies of your opponents. You just got to sit back and use Ice Blade or Aqua Jet to do 70 damage, and on a coin flip you get to do another 20 snipe. While you say that's a lot of energy to power up Empoleon, keep in mind there was double Rainbow Energy and Scramble Energy, which Pokemon remade as Reversal Energy, which means if you're behind on prizes, you slap Scramble Energy onto Empoleon, you got to use Aqua Jet for 1 energy attachment, doing 70 and a potential 20 damage snipe. But that's not the only version the deck was played as. There was also the Delta Marowak. With Delta Marowak, you had Holland's Magneton in the deck, so all you needed were basic water energy, and then you did Energy Bone to snipe your opponent's board. Now we go on forward another year. In 2008, Empoleon Level X made a pretty big splash in the metagame, mainly because it was a very good counter to the popular best deck of the format, Gardevoir. Gardevoir had pretty big boards with a lot of Pokemon powers all over it, and this Empoleon Bronzong list kind of preyed on that board state. Empoleon itself is a new version, but still relied on sniping to do a lot of spread damage. Dual Splash let you choose 2 of your opponent's Pokemon and do 30 to each, and Surf Together was a 50 base plus 10 more damage for each of your bench Pokemon, and if you got a Tails coin flip, you damaged your own Pokemon, but I don't think that mattered too much because your partner Bronzong was probably the guy in the active the most. Bronzong had the nifty Pokebody Cursed Ally, which when Bronzong was in the active between turns did 10 damage to any Pokemon with Pokepowers between turns, and its free attack pain amplifier just put 10 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon that already were damaged. And then Empoleon was kind of in there with Empoleon Level X. Empoleon Level X's Pokepower Supreme Command, once during your turn, let you choose up to 2 of your opponent's cards in their hand, put them on the side of the table, and said you don't get to play with that next turn until the end of their turn, and then it goes back into their hand, and had Hydro Impact for 3 water energy, which let you do 80 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon, and Empoleon couldn't attack the next turn. And, well, Empoleon Level X is pretty good. It doesn't compare to the king of the SP era, and that is Palkia G Level X, sitting at 26.9% of the meta in 2009. While there was some other Palkia and Palkia Level X being played, this was the main Palkia getting played because it got a lot of cool SP Pokemon support. Palkia G Level X was played by itself in tandem with this Mesprit, which had the Pokepower Psychic Bind. When you played it from your hand, your opponent couldn't use Pokepowers during their next turn. Or with Dialga G Level X, which had the Pokebody that did the same thing, except it didn't apply to SP Pokemon. Palkia G level X itself had a really cool ability called Lost Cyclone, which let you, once during your turn, choose either you or your opponent, and if they had 4 more bench Pokemon, they Lost Zoned their Pokemon away until they only had 3 less. So you can kind of see how the deck starts to become Mesprit. Okay, my turn. Lost Cyclone. Discard my Mesprit. Oh look, I have another Mesprit. It was a very interesting and different time that not many people were a fan of. And now we're moving on to modern Pokemon as it's becoming more familiar to us. The first water deck to really pop off is the Keldeo EX Blastoise deck. While Keldeo wasn't the main attacker in that deck, it was actually Black Kyurem EX, a dragon-type Pokemon who did 200 damage, but you had to sack 3 energy from yourself, paired with Blastoise, which once again had Rain Dance, now under the new name of Deluge, letting you attach water energy to any of your Pokemon as much as you'd like during your turn. And Keldeo EX was in there because the Russian ability let it switch into the active, and Secret Sword is a 50 plus 20 more for each water energy attached to Keldeo, but this was not the true form of Keldeo EX. It was 2013, it was pretty popular. And then you got to 2014, where Genesect Virizion was everywhere, so it kind of sat in the corner for a bit, saying, I will be here, but I am not enjoying this. Until it came back in the most popular form, which involves Archie's Ace in the Hole. Archie's Ace in the Hole is a really cool supporter. If it is the only card in your hand, you can put a water Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench. And it was much more aggressive and very combo heavy reliant. If you failed the combo, you were kind of dead on the water for a bit. In some certain lists, it was just thrown in to act as a free pivot, using the Russian ability and having the Float Stone to free retreat out of a sticky situation. Keldeo Blastoise, that is a really iconic deck. And this next card is what I would call the true king of black and white. Even though he's from early X and Y, Seismitoad EX just commanded so much respect from the player base, with a whopping 25% of the meta playing it back when it first released. Seismitoad EX had the powerful attack Quaking Punch, which did 30 damage and shut off your opponent's items for the next turn, which it did cost 2 energies, but keep in mind this is a time where DCE existed, so a single energy attachment would get you going. And pair with that Hypnotoxic Laser and Burbank City Gym, you would quickly start to rack up damage on your opponent's side of the board, while also preventing them from playing the game like they should. And if you didn't want them to have even more fun, some players even opted to put in Garbotoxin Garbodor with a single tool attachment shot of all of your opponent's abilities. While in 2015 Seismitoad EX was the king at about 25% of the meta, it quickly fell off in 2016, being the most popular deck to play. However, it still had a very strong impact on the meta. With its new partner Giratina EX, it was able to set up a more control type build with a lower damage output. Giratina EX had the ability to be immune to Megas, and its attack Chaos Wheel could do 100 damage and prevent your opponent from playing tools, special energies, or stadium cards from their hand. And to slot in another attacker like Latios EX, you create this very powerful wild deck that, though not as popular, players still had to know how to play around. And in 2016, other players also tried to make it work with all the water tool stuff that was running around, but it was Giratina was better. And Seismitoad EX was so powerful that the reason why this next deck is being mentioned is because it was counter to whatever made Seismitoad click. Wailord EX does not show up a ton in the 2015 format, however, it was able to take some pretty high spots like second place in US Nationals just because it walled everything. Wailord Wall was Wailord EX paired with Suicune, with Wailord EX just having a massive amount of HP, and Suicune was just there with the ability Safeguard to prevent any EX from damaging or hurting it at all. And while you think, that's a lot of energy to attack, there are 0 energy cards in this deck. Wailord EX's game plan was to spam as many supporters as possible, as much healing as possible, Use cards like Pokemon Fan Club to stretch out your Pokemon while under item lock, to use cards like Flagrant and Enhanced Hammer to get rid of every single DCE it came across, and use cards like Q to force your opponent to play cards from their hand or potentially lose all their resources, and to prevent your opponent from even taking prize cards to win the game, you played cards like AC and Cassius to scoop up any Pokemon in play, as well as Proxies and Max Potion to just, you know, heal off even more damage. It is so funny to me that Seismitoad EX was so prevalent and so powerful with Hypnotoxic lasers that a silly little deck with 0 energy in it actually almost won a whole event. And as we move on, there are a couple of decks to take note of. However, the percentages for these decks isn't as high as previous formats. That's because a lot of decks were played back then. So this Greninja Break, which I'm calling the True Water deck from X and Y, is sitting at the highest 7.21% of the format in 2016 because the love was spread all around. However, if you played back then, you knew of Greninja Break, and Greninja Breaks knew of themselves, and everyone complained about Greninja Break because it was a really good card. While Greninja Break itself was basically a stage 3, Frogadier attack water duplicates, which for a single water energy lets you search your deck for up to 3 Frogadier and slap them down on your bench. And using cards like Dival, Evo Soda, and Wally, you can really quickly get your board set up. It was just a coin flip to see if you even got that far. Greninja itself had some 2 very interesting variants. The better one that had free retreat was the Shadow Stitching one, which did 40 damage and shut off your opponent's abilities for the next turn, or had Moonlight Slash, which is 60 damage, and if you return the water energy attached to Greninja to your hand, did 20 more, which is relevant since the Break's ability, when it was in the active, let you sack a water energy card from your hand to do 6 damage counters to any of your opponent's Pokemon. You get to do 60 damage snipes. However, some people also played this other Greninja, which had the ability Water Shuriken, which let you sack a water energy card from your hand, do 3 damage counters to one of your opponent's Pokemon, but it didn't have to be in the active, and Mist Slash did 50 damage and wasn't blocked by any lock decks running around either. Greninja Break was very popular, and even had a cool partner of Talonflame with the Galewing's ability, which let you start it in the active if it was in your starting hand. Volcanion EX, which you're like, that's a fire type Pokemon. Well, technically it was both. Dual types were a thing back in 2016, and Volcanion was pretty popular, even though it wasn't super popular at first. Come 2017, it was about almost 10% of the meta, since Decidueye Vileplume was everywhere. It was scary, commanded respect, and Volcanion hit it for weakness. Volcanion was really cool since it had the Steam Up ability. Once during your turn, let you sack a fire energy from your hand to do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon, and this ability stacked. And paired with cards like Kiawe, Turtonator GX, even the baby of Volcanion's Power Heater could get powered up quite a bit. If you're playing choice bands and have a couple Steam Ups up, you get to accelerate energy onto your bench while potentially KOing an active Pokemon, and Starmie's Space Beacon ability let you sack any card from your hand to recycle 2 basic energies and put them back. You see how the damage just kind of goes up? Volcanion EX was a very aggressive deck and capitalized on slower setting up decks such as the Decidueye GX, which sometimes struggled to get its footing in the game. And those are probably the 2 most prominent water types of X and Y. However, an honorable mention has to go to Octillery. While Octillery didn't seem to have a ton of results at first, once Buzzwole and Lycanroc hit the metagame, it shot up in usage. Octillery had this wonderful ability called Abyssal Hand, letting you fill your hand up to 5 cards once during your turn. And when Gardevoir GX was the top of the meta, it was played in the list since it paired really nicely with the Glade ran in it. Glade had the Premonition ability, which lets you rearrange the top 5 cards of your deck, and with Octillery, even if you could only draw 1 or 2 cards, you can guarantee that card would be pretty good. And in Buzzwole Lycanroc decks, it was there because it synergized with Brooklet Hill, which searched out a basic water or fighting Pokemon and just slapped it onto your bench, meaning there was no reason not to just slot this little guy in for a little extra consistency, and that is why he was in so many winning decks. And then Sun Moon came, and there wasn't really a water prominent deck at the time. Alolan Ninetales GX for a DCE, so a single energy attachment, could do 50 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon and was frequently paired with GCGY GX, which had Forest of Giant Plants, which let you evolve your grass Pokemon as soon as they got into play. So you sit with the Ninetales GX in the active, doing 50 damage and then putting 20 damage around to make all the math all nice and pretty. And the GX attack on Ninetales was also super terrifying as well. Ice Patch GX let you move all the damage counters from Ninetales onto your opponent's Pokemon, healing it and potentially taking a KO. Ninetales kind of died off for a bit, and then you get to LAIC and the Fairy type Alolan Ninetales got printed, which has the really good ability called Mysterious Guidance, which when you evolve into it, you get to search your deck for 2 item cards and put them into your hand. So there became this Decidueye Ninetales Zoroark GX deck, which was super popular during LAIC, but it was like nowhere else during the format. And there's some other cards going on this turn. It's like an Articuno GX and Oranguru Control, which had this Cold Crush GX attack, which sacked all the energy from both active Pokemons, and you could run Misty and Lorelei, sack 5 cards, and use your GX attack again. But that didn't really see much use. The one that saw more use is Keldeo GX in 2019, which was immune to both EX and GX Pokemon, and it was used in ADP to get cheeky double KOs and fire heavy meta, and also shared energy typing with ADP. It kind of faded into obscurity, especially when this Pokemon in 2020 Tapu Fini was printed with the sole existence was to counter Blacephalon GX. Blacephalon GX was super popular, and Tapu Fini, if your opponent had an Ultra Beast, did 100 damage for 1 colorless energy, which, let me remind you, Blacephalon GX was weak to, so suddenly a single energy attachment got you 2 prizes plus if you're playing it in ADP, which is pretty good. But like, the next most popular card to really see a ton of play is Fion with 21% usage, because it had a really busted support ability. Fion had the ability Whirlpool Section, which once during your turn, if it is on the bench, you can force your opponent to switch their active to their bench, and you get to put it on the bottom of your deck, which was really cute because it prevented you from decking out, as well as forcing a Soft Gust on your opponent's side of the board. That was basically the Sun and Moon era. It started off kind of hot with Alolan Ninetales and then kind of fizzled into no water decks being played. Even though fire types were the most dominant card on the format, they just never really printed a good counter water type deck. And now we get to Sword and Shield. And if you are any fan of GLC, your mind immediately goes to Inteleon. Inteleon and its pre-evolution Drizzle have the ability of shading Dealings. Shady Dealings on the Drizzle gets you 1 trainer when you evolve, and if you evolve into your Inteleon, you get 2 trainers from your deck into your hand. But there was also this cute little sniper dude, Rapid Strike Inteleon, which once during your turn you got to put 2 damage counters onto one of your opponent's Pokemon. While we as GLC fans think it's absolutely busted, when it released it was not even 5% of the meta. But come in 2022, especially with the release of the Rapid Strike and Single Strike archetypes, Inteleon exploded into popularity, especially since it was paired with Urshifu VMAX. Now, the reason why I don't think Inteleon was super popular at first was because there was Smooth Over Magcargo and the basic bench sitter Oranguru, with the Primate Wisdom letting you switch a card from your hand with your top deck, meaning with Smooth Over Magcargo you can guarantee any card from your deck, whereas Inteleon and Drizzle only guaranteed trainers. Still really good, but not as good as this bench sitting combo. However, come 2022, everything changes. Things rotate. Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX is absolutely everywhere, and it ate the support Inteleon gave you in shards. Whereas the quick shooting Inteleon helped you with math. It was just a happy little marriage. And then comes Palkia V-Star in the Sword and Shield era, which was very prominent when it first released, and honestly was probably one of the most popular cards to be played until Lugia V-Star was printed, and then it went disappeared off the face of the earth. Palkia V-Star, when it was initially released, paired really good with Inteleon as well, especially because it came along with Irida, one of the most busted supporters for water we have seen. It let you get a water Pokemon and an item card to your hand, which pairs really nicely with the Inteleon line. And later in life, Palkia V-Star was paired with Chien-Pao when it came out. Palkia V-Star just didn't stay relevant. They tried to pair it with Terrapagos, and with the Terrapagos on your board, you could have the Arrow Zero Underdepths to make boards even wider and do even more damage. Palkia V-Star just couldn't keep up with the much more powerful Lugia V-Star. However, that's not the best card from Sword and Shield. In fact, this next one, you could argue is Lumineon V. Allowed you, when you played it from your hand, to search your deck for a supporter card, and while this is a reprint of a very familiar Tapu Lele, first turn supporter rules had changed since then, so it was undervalued when it first came out personally, is what I think. However, come 2023, when Palkia V-Star was at its peak, it was in a ton of Lugia V-Star decks, since it allowed you to utilize one-of techs like Thornton to switch around your Pokemon and guarantee that surprise attack from nowhere. And then come 2024, I remember it being a favorite in many EX-based decks that don't run V Pokemon, since Lumineon V became an instant search for Arven, and Arven allowed you to search your deck for an item card and a tool, allowing you to go and search out for a Seal Stone to guarantee you any one card from your deck, which was a really cute little package which extended Lumineon's life a little bit more. And this next card is honestly one of the best support Pokemon to ever be printed, and that is Radiant Greninja. It was 20% of the meta in 2022, it was 51% of the meta in 2023, and it was in 42% of the meta in 2024. Radiant Greninja came out and it made a statement. It's a super prevalent card because it's one of the best support Pokemon. It allowed you to sack any energy card from your hand, including special energy, to draw 2 cards, and that paired very well into decks that love their energy in the discard, like Gardevoir EX and Miraidon EX. It was perfect partner for Chien-Pao, and its Moonlight Shuriken in Chien-Pao or Palkia V-Star decks was actually very strong as well. And you might notice I know a little bit more about Chien-Pao because Chien-Pao EX was my deck of choice. Chien-Pao PX was about not even 10% of the meta when it came out in 2023, even though it had the really good support of Irida and Baxcalibur. Baxcalibur was just a reprint of the Deluge Blastoise that we have all come to know and love. And with Irida, you could get your super cool Baxcalibur up really fast. However, Chien-Pao didn't see a whole bunch of play until people started pairing it with Palkia V-Star in 2024, which brought it up to 19.39% of the meta. And then the Sword and Shield stuff rotated, and Chien-Pao has been sitting in the corner collecting dust, waiting for the chance to come into the limelight again. And that's kind of been the story of Scarlet and Violet so far. We've had Iron Bundle, which is the reprint of Fion pretty much, except you discard it instead of putting it onto your bottom of your deck, which has seen really good use currently, and potentially even more, though the ongoing meta is still developing. And while there hasn't been a really powerful water type deck from the Scarlet and Violet era, I can see one potentially on the future, especially with the release of the upcoming Surfing Beach. Hopefully get water type a little bit more love. Anyways, that was just me going through the history and looking at the data. But what does the data say? If we were to order the cards by the best percentage over the years they were played, number 1 is definitely Radiant Greninja. It had a 38.10% average over 3 years and dominated every single format it was a part of, At number 2, we have Feraligatr at 30% in the single year of use. Blastoise EX rounds up number 3 with a 29.70% usage, also for 1 year. As we leave the top 3, Palkia G Level X in number 4 with a 26.9% usage, also in 1 year. And at last, with number 5, we got Lumineon V, who was at a 24.77% use over 3 years and was especially popular in its later years. For number 6 through 10, we have Octillery, Empoleon Level X, Fion, Iron Bundle, and Inteleon. However, that's not all there is to Pokemon. And while Radiant Greninja is a pretty obvious choice for number 1, if I had to choose a Pokemon based on the impact they had in the format, as how it shaped the format, I don't think Radiant Greninja would be it. Radiant Greninja was in most every single deck because almost every single deck said, hey, a very good conditional draw card is worth it, and just slapped it in. And it didn't really change how the metagame worked too much. Like, maybe some decks had to prepare for Radiant Greninja attack, but most of the time it just sat there on the bench. No, in my mind, weirdly enough, this card isn't even on the top 10. Seismitoad EX is probably the best water type card of all time, and you can call me biased. However, Seismitoad EX forced players to respect it in deck building. With Hypnotoxic and Verbank City, it racked up a bunch of damage, and if you didn't prepare for Seismitoad EX or didn't know how to play around item lock, you were completely cooked. Even in its second year in 2016, you had to know how to play around the Seismitoad deck with Giratina that was immune to Megas, and tech for that too, otherwise you could be completely walled if you prepared your deck wrong. And the card designer themselves regret designing and releasing Seismitoad EX when asked by Christian Hoffer of comicbook.com which card they regretted designing and releasing the most. It was Seismitoad EX, among many, but that was the one that came to his mind first. And if you regret releasing this atrocity onto the world and you can name it off the top of your mind, doesn't that kind of bump it up the totem pole a bit and make it one of the most dominating cards of all time? And to me, the most dominating, most meta-defining, most meta-altering card of all time would have to be the best, and to me, Seismitoad kind of fulfills all three definitions. Now, of course, I could totally be wrong and totally miss something. I didn't play all of these formats, and be sure to let me know what your number 1 water Pokemon card of all time is. Also, let me know, did I miss any water Pokemon cards? There was a lot of data I had to go over, and I did research some that I just left off this video completely, and there's others I probably missed completely as well, just because there's lacking data, especially in those early years. However, I had a ton of fun of putting this video together, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe because next video is going to be about fire types, and be sure to share it with a friend, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!